A mega corporation with annual revenues exceeding $158 billion sees its gross margin consistently capped at a meager 6%. Could you keep such an enterprise alive? When you peel back the plastic wrap on a new iPhone and flip over the device, the text designed by Apple in California stands out with Silicon Valley's characteristic arrogance. Beneath it, however, is a barely noticeable line, assembled in China. Many tend to view this small print through a condescending lens, perceiving it merely as a blood-soaked factory fueled by cheap labor. But this is an illusion. This hidden commercial machine within the depths of globalization operates with such efficiency that it strikes fear into multinational tech giants worldwide. It is Honhai Precision Industry Company, Limited, better known as Foxconn, which at its peak employed over 900,000 workers, forming a tireless industrial city-state. This behemoth has dominantly swallowed more than 40% of the global electronics manufacturing market share. In 2018, it achieved record-breaking revenues of $175 billion, propelling founder Terry Gou's personal wealth to an all-time high of $6.5 billion. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. The real mystery lies in why this new behemoth, with revenues exceeding $500 billion, struggles to keep its gross margin alive at a mere 6% when the average technology supply chain boasts margins above 24%. How did it survive on this precarious tightrope and even force Steve Jobs into heavy dependency? To grasp the foundational logic of this empire, we must first examine its leader. Mr. Guo often carries a string of prayer beads he obtained from a temple dedicated to Genghis Khan, whom he reveres as his greatest hero. He manages his workforce with a military-like efficiency that borders on ruthlessness. When Western giants like Dell executives step into Mr. Guo's office, they are frequently stunned by the sight. There are no plush executive chairs or lavish floor-to-ceiling windows, only rough cement floors and tin roofs, with even the internal telephones in disrepair. This is not an act of poverty but a meticulously designed psychological warfare tactic to convey a stark message to Western clients. Everything here is cheap, cheaper still. Every penny will be squeezed into productivity, never wasted on ostentation. Within Foxconn, cost calculation and efficiency maximization are taken to chilling extremes. To save money, hand soap in the factory restrooms is continuously diluted until it barely forms any foam. Even executives half-jokingly say that Mr. Guo's multi-billion-dollar fortune was squeezed out of every penny saved. He does not hide his feral nature, comparing himself to an indestructible cockroach and a hard-working water buffalo. He knows all too well that in the ruthless supply chain jungle, only the fastest and most enduring beasts survive. But if survival depended solely on the frugality inside the tin-roofed office and the sweat of workers, Foxconn was long ago superseded by cheaper factories in Southeast Asia or India. What truly terrifies about Chairman Guo is his transformation of simple labor cost advantages into a highly sophisticated industrial algorithm. How did he manage to bind physical distance, time, and human frailties so tightly together to create the unrivaled China speed that even Steve Jobs could not escape? The core engine of this massive machine is about to roar for the first time. In many people's minds, contract manufacturing seems like a low-tech, labor-intensive activity. Many competitors back then naively believed Foxconn's growth was simply due to luck, capitalizing on the immense population dividend from mainland China. However, if cheap labor were Chairman Guo's only trump card, facing even cheaper Southeast Asian factories, this empire would have collapsed long ago under the law of the jungle. What truly sends shivers down one's spine is how Chairman Guo ruthlessly merged vast human resources with extremely rigorous industrial efficiency into a physical algorithm known as ECMS. This strategy completely upended the fundamental logic of contract manufacturing. Previously, original equipment manufacturers simply followed clients' designs and assembled parts accordingly. But Foxconn was not content to merely be an assembler. They extended their hands all the way to upstream mold development, component manufacturing, even whole machine collaborative design, and every minute detail in global logistics management. Chairman Guo devised a highly structured methodology. His approach is incredibly rigorous, breaking down any product into 10 meticulous tiers, from the most inconspicuous knob to complex electronic modules. The ultimate goal is a single-minded focus on cost suppression. In the sprawling Shenzhen Longhua Industrial Park spanning several square kilometers, raw materials enter through the gates and emerge as finished products, after being subjected to countless maximally compressed processes, packed and shipped worldwide. Supply chain issues that competitors might spend weeks coordinating across continents are resolved at Foxconn with a casual lunch between workshop supervisors in the employee cafeteria. This results in the world's shortest physical supply chain distance and fastest response time. It was this near insane efficiency that completely won over Apple by the end of 1997. At that time, Jobs returned to a nearly bankrupt Apple with lofty ambitions and a highly demanding delivery schedule for Mac computers. To secure Apple's business, Chairman Goh personally oversaw the production progress on the bustling assembly lines, working overnight shifts. With just 3 minutes left before Apple's deadline, they miraculously delivered the final batch of products. These critical 3 minutes earned Jobs' absolute trust and firmly bound Foxconn to Apple's future for the next decade. From the iMac in 2000 to the first iPhone in 2007, this machine running at breakneck speed has become inextricably linked with the ambitions of tech giants. However, when we shift our focus from this monumental industrial marvel to the cold financial statements, one can feel the most vulnerable underbelly of this massive machine. Despite a staggering revenue of 6 trillion new Taiwan dollars, Foxconn's gross margin is consistently locked at around 6%. It's worth noting that the average gross margin for the entire tech supply chain often exceeds 24%, with some precision manufacturing plants reaching up to 30% or even 50%. Foxconn's financial performance indeed treads on a knife's edge, with its net profit margin dipping as low as 2.5%. This thin 6% gross margin represents the underlying anxiety driving all of Red Sea Empire's commercial activities. Such meager profits mean there is no room for error. A mere 1 cent increase in raw material costs, or even slight fluctuations in orders from major clients, can trigger a financial tsunami. The harsh reality behind these figures was once vividly illustrated when a key client returned 5 million units due to minor cosmetic defects, compelling Red Sea to incur over RMB 1 billion in countermeasures. In such profit-squeezing scenarios, Chairman Guo flies into a rage and often sets up a temporary office on the production line, declaring emphatically, "I want to leave until the yield rate meets its target." It is within this razor-thin margin that Foxconn skillfully manages substantial cash flows, ensuring its survival. However, the other side of the coin is the immense financial pressure that cascades down through each layer. The financial pressure ultimately fell on the shoulders of the bottom-line assembly line workers. To squeeze profits from a meager 6% gross margin, the management system had to act like a bone knife, excising all elements of human empathy that impede efficiency. Over 1 million young bodies were compelled to perform high-intensity, low-margin labor day after day, in monotonous repetition. This finely tuned machine attempted to lock down human emotions and fatigue with industrial gears, but humans are not components made of aluminum alloy or silicon rubber. When extreme discipline collided with repressed youth, a systemic storm capable of shaking the foundations of an empire quietly brewed beneath the surface. In 2010, Shenzhen Longhua was a massive industrial city-state housing 400,000 people. That spring, this super machine for wealth creation emitted a bone-chilling crack. Within just a few months. 14 young workers in succession leaped from tall buildings, a desperate protest against a system that had stripped them of their names and individuality. This series of 14 suicides was not merely a result of the fragility of youthful minds, but a systemic failure between Red Sea-like military discipline and the millions of new generation laborers. These young people, born in the 80s and 90s, were markedly different from their docile parents, possessing strong self-awareness. When thrown into an intensely fragmented environment with zero communication and even precise timing for bathroom breaks, they easily fell into profound despair. In response to this unprecedented humanitarian crisis, Chairman Guo and management initially displayed a chillingly cold engineering mindset. Not about easing the human spirit on the assembly line, but using purely physical means to patch this system flaw. The company quickly ordered the installation of a total area of 1.5 million square meters of anti-fall nets, and even required employees to sign humiliating non-suicide pledges internally. If frontline workers made mistakes, they were forced to read public apologies in front of all colleagues, using such psychological pressure to maintain absolute discipline. This storm swept up major clients like Apple in California as well. Initially, Jobs tried to shield the company with cold statistical logic, insisting that Foxconn was not a sweatshop and that the suicide rate at their facilities was actually lower than the national average in mainland China. However, global public opinion against blood-soaked Apple was too fierce. By 2011, then CEO Tim Cook had to fly personally to Shenzhen Longhua to meet with suicide prevention experts for confidential talks, demanding comprehensive reforms. But what truly cut Chairman Guo deep and forced the empire's hand were not external moral condemnations but a sudden breach of financial limits. To quickly quell public outrage, Red Sea was compelled to raise wages twice within a short period, first increasing base salaries to 1,200 yuan per month, with some workers eventually seeing their pay jump to 2,000 yuan. This concession had catastrophic consequences. From then on, labor costs skyrocketed by 5 billion yuan annually for Red Sea, overall employment expenses soaring over 30%. For a contract manufacturing empire that perennially struggled at the 6% gross margin survival line, this is a fatal financial disaster. The era of boundless demographic dividends along China's coastal regions has come to an end with these 14 muted crashes. To offset the skyrocketing labor costs, Chairman Guo made a monumental decision that would reshape China's electronics manufacturing landscape: mass relocation inland. Massive production capabilities began to transfer from Shenzhen to central and western cities like Zhengzhou and Chengdu in a frenzy. The calculations behind this move were precise yet ruthless. When Foxconn settled in Zhengzhou in 2010, the local minimum wage was only RMB 800 per month, approximately 72.7% of Shenzhen's rate. Inland provinces offered abundant land and tax subsidies to boost their GDP growth. However, while the factory locations changed, management did not soften. Instead, it intensified control. To compensate for the lower skill level of inland workers and maintain quality yields, Zhengzhou facilities introduced an oppressive silence policy. Workers recalled that during Chairman Guo's inspections, the workshop atmosphere was chillingly tense, with security personnel standing at attention in helmets. Any conversation unrelated to work inside the factory would result in immediate dismissal. By this point, Chairman Guo's foundational logic had undergone a complete transformation. He realized the risk of gathering hundreds of thousands of emotionally volatile workers who could resist authority. This scenario posed an imminent threat akin to a time bomb set to explode at any moment. Consequently, in July 2011, Chairman Guo took further drastic measures to ensure order and compliance. Feeling the escalating cost of human labor, Chairman Guo ruthlessly proposed a massive plan: 1 million robots. He aimed to replace flesh and blood on production lines with tireless mechanical arms that would never complain or jump from buildings. This gargantuan commercial machine did not soften after its self-inflicted wounds. Instead, it slid into an even colder abyss. Guo was plotting the ultimate evolution away from dependence on human labor, but to secure this high-stakes transformation, he had to target the once unreachable tech giants of a century. Standing a covert international hunt filled with cunning and deceit has quietly begun. Deep down, Chairman Guo harbored a profound fear of survival that few could imagine. This fear originated from none other than Apple, which he himself had elevated to an exalted position. By 2015, as iPhone sales peaked, Apple's leadership, driven by extreme concerns over supply chain security, began diversifying manufacturing orders ruthlessly. for the iPhone 6s production shares. Apple even brought in another contract manufacturer to level the playing field with Hon Hai. Guo acutely sensed the perilous scent of danger. If Hon Hai remained only at the assembly and circuit board welding stage, he would always be an expendable low-level laborer. He desperately needed a trump card to counterbalance Apple's influence within the high-end smartphone profit-sharing diagram, where the most costly and technologically challenging components were liquid crystal display panels. In this lucrative avenue of displays, a century-old Japanese giant, Sharp, despite being on the brink of bankruptcy due to poor management, still holds the world's leading IGZO technology. At that time, Apple had already adopted Sharp screens across its iPad Pro devices, with Sharp supplying as much as 90% of the required panels. In his calculations, Chairman Guo saw a precise strategy. Swallowing Sharp would allow Foxconn to regain significant leverage over Apple and place it in a dependency trap where it could not function without Foxconn. This cross-border hunt, dubbed Sharp-Hon Hai romance, was rife with betrayal and anger from the start. Back in 2012, Chairman Guo aimed to invest around 13 billion yen into Sharp and promised the then chairman to jointly take down Samsung. However, shortly after the agreement was reached, Sharp disclosed a massive financial black hole, projecting losses of up to 250 billion yen, with its stock price plummeting like a free fall. Facing such huge paper losses, Chairman Guo demanded renegotiation, but was met with a strong refusal from Sharp's leadership. During a secret meeting due to the Japanese side's arrogant attitude, an already agitated chairman, Guo lost control of his temper, angrily throwing ashtrays and water bottles, resulting in a public breakdown. Yet, like a relentless wolf, he never easily gave up on his prey. Years later, as Sharp's financial situation worsened to such a degree that even the government-backed Industrial Revitalization Corporation sought to intervene for restructuring, Chairman Guo returned with a vengeance. This time, he dangled a wild carrot that completely bewildered the Sharp board, an investment of 489 billion yen. To lull Japanese society and the upper echelons of Sharp into complacency, he made touching promises, assuming all of Sharp's debt, guaranteeing no layoffs, and allowing a Japanese executive to remain as CEO. Under the hypnotic allure of such heavy investments, Sharp officially rejected state support in late February 2016, fully committing to Foxconn. In that moment when the prey willingly stepped into the trap, this capital game reached its most nerve-wracking phase of psychological warfare. On the 24th of February, the eve of signing, Sharp's management naively presented a 100-page list to Foxconn, detailing potential contingent liabilities amounting to 350 billion yen. Some at Sharp arrogantly assumed that given Foxconn's efforts to outmaneuver competitors, the deal was already set in stone, and this list was merely a formality. However, they grossly underestimated Chairman Guo's ruthlessness in capital games. To the keen-scented Foxconn leader, this list was not an obstacle but a perfect tool for leverage. Upon receiving it, Foxconn immediately changed its stance and unilaterally announced the suspension of the signing process. This bombshell, detonated by Sharp itself, pushed the venerable company into a dire predicament. By then, state support had long withdrawn from the scene, leaving Sharp with 510 billion yen in bank loans, coming due at the end of March. If Foxconn were to withdraw its investment, Sharp would face bankruptcy within days, facing a broken capital chain and, in essence, liquidation. Chairman Guo seized this critical moment for survival. He mobilized an extensive team of lawyers and accountants to thoroughly audit the books, executing textbook-level extreme pressure tactics. Under the terrifying threat of bankruptcy, Sharp lost all its negotiating leverage. Ultimately, Hon Hai drastically reduced the investment amount by about 10 billion yen, securing an absolute controlling stake of 66% with just 388.8 billion yen. Before the ink was even dry on the contract, the veneer of goodwill was instantly torn apart. The Japanese promise to have a Japanese president was dashed into oblivion, replaced directly by Hon Hai's number 2, David Ting, who took full control. The commitment not to lay off employees was swiftly forgotten. In an internal letter to his staff, Chairman Guo announced with sharp words the plan for deep business integration and massive layoffs. As Japanese media later bitterly analyzed, Chairman Guo's initial huge offer was like a beautiful mirage that misled Sharp into betting everything. At the final moment he pounced, seizing the soft underbelly of the target to end the battle swiftly. In the face of absolute increases in efficiency and profit, the pride and sentiment of century-old enterprises were nothing more than fragile chips in the game of capital. By 2019, Chairman Guo gradually stepped back into the shadows, handing over this vast Honhai empire to his successor, Young Wei Liu, also known as President Liu. On the surface, Honhai remained an invincible manufacturing behemoth globally, still a dominant force in global manufacturing, but internally, red alerts have been ringing continuously. Why? Because the cycle for users to replace their smartphones has significantly lengthened. Even worse, Apple, which once fattened Honhai with massive orders, is now coldly passing the knife and fork to competitors like Pegatron, aiming to dismantle Honhai's monopolistic dominance. For a behemoth worth over 6 trillion new Taiwan dollars, stagnation equals starvation. Chairman Liu was acutely aware that the old pie of consumer electronics could no longer sustain the empire's future. Honhai must forcibly pivot towards finding the next super-sized pie with trillion-dollar potential. In the spring of 2021, Chairman Liu formally unveiled the decisive 3+3 strategic blueprint for the company's survival. It sounds like a polished public relations slogan, but fundamentally serves as an escape route map dripping with anxiety. Honhai has fixed its sights on three emerging industries: electric vehicles, digital health, and robotics. Additionally, it has identified artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and next-generation communications as its core technologies. Among these, electric vehicles have been pushed to the absolute forefront. The underlying rationale is a financial calculation that gets the blood pumping. In Honhai's strategic calculus, by 2030, the global electric vehicle market will be an enormous gold mine worth 30 trillion new Taiwan dollars. Their target is audacious. They aim to capture 10% of the global market share. If they can penetrate deeply enough to boost their value proposition in the entire vehicle bill of materials from a traditional 10% to a staggering 40%, that single vehicle manufacturing business alone could inject between NT $900 billion and NT $1.2 trillion into Honhai's empire annually, a sum large enough to free the company from its precarious situation of barely surviving on a 6% gross margin in contract manufacturing. However, the automotive industry is far more brutal than electronic assembly ever was. A smart car, which involves personal safety, requires supply chain depths that cannot be easily filled by simply erecting several metal-roofed factories. Honhai wisely avoided direct confrontation with Tesla or traditional automakers and did not want to risk failure as a new entrant in the automotive sector from the outset. Instead, they aimed to become the unseen force behind all new electric vehicle players. Thus, the Mi-8 open platform for electric vehicles was born. Honhai attempted to transform its vertically integrated model from the 3C era into a new commissioned design and manufacturing service. They openly shared the underlying physical architecture of automobiles, launching EV-kit toolkits that include interfaces for autonomous driving, limited control braking, steering, and other fundamental controls. The underlying logic of this approach is chilling. Honhai aspires to become an amalgamation of the Android system in the electric vehicle industry plus TSMC, using standardized chassis to lure players worldwide, particularly new startups with only beautiful PowerPoint presentations and software design expertise but lacking mass production capabilities. Along with traditional automakers looking to cut costs, they entice these entities into the market with low barriers, allowing them to sell their dreams under the spotlight, while quietly harvesting the most lucrative manufacturing and supply chain profits behind the scenes. Within a short period, this alliance has rapidly amassed over 2,700 global companies. However, anyone who drives an intelligent electric vehicle knows that the true essence of modern automotive manufacturing lies in the seamless integration of hardware and software along with robust computational power at its core. Foxconn attempts to apply the hardware open source logic from the 3C era to deconstruct today's software-defined smart cars. This is precisely where they face a critical blind spot, a form of dimensional mismatch. It explains why their Mi platform, despite being launched with great fanfare, ultimately attracts mainly weak peripheral players and fails to capture major clients. Moreover, the throat of intelligent vehicles remains choked by baseband chips. Chairman Liu understands this all too well. Without semiconductors, all grand visions are mere castles in the air. Faced with a significant shortage of over 28,000 semiconductor talents in Taiwan, Foxconn, like a ravenous wolf, is aggressively stockpiling technical manpower. Not only do they design automotive microprocessors themselves, but their reach extends to India, where they aim to establish a joint venture wafer fabrication plant. Simultaneously, the geopolitical icebergs around the world are remorselessly closing in. The old model of centralized industrial city-states, with massive labor forces gathered within a few acres in a single country, is nearing its end. Foxconn decisively shed the vestiges of that outdated era and initiated a localization strategy known as BOL for construction and operation. They have dispersed their capital around the globe. Joint ventures are underway to build factories in Thailand, and they are laying the groundwork for an electric bus base in Indonesia. Even in Kaohsiung, they are setting up new battery mass production. This eastern behemoth is painfully shedding its old skin of contract manufacturing and attempting to grow new fangs at the deepest levels of global industry. However, on the North American continent, the world's most fiercely competitive automotive battlefield, Hon Hai desperately needs a physical foothold in car manufacturing to prove its capabilities to the world. It is this extreme desire for production leverage that will drag Hon Hai into a treacherous swamp filled with lies, betrayal, and ruthless coldness. Ohio was once the pride of General Motors, boasting a massive facility covering 6.2 million square feet. In late autumn of 2021, this place welcomed a new owner with an intensely hungry gaze and a distinct Taiwanese accent. For Hon Hai, a Red Sea empire eager to find production leverage globally and escape dependency on a single market, the factory, on the brink of closure due to financial difficulties, exuded a tempting allure. The previous owner was Losstown Motors, once a Wall Street darling among new American automakers. To secure this foothold in North America's automotive industry, Hon Hai launched an intimidating capital blitzkrieg, acquiring the state-of-the-art superfactory for just $230 million, an incredibly low price. They then spent another $50 million on stocks and invested $55 million to form a joint venture. Bear in mind that in the voracious auto manufacturing sector, where billions of dollars are often consumed, Hon Hai managed this with merely over $300 million in cash. Not only did they purchase an extensive factory fully equipped, end of current text translation, they also absorbed approximately 400 top American automotive engineering experts. More directly, they secured a ready-to-go manufacturing contract to produce Lordstown's flagship electric pickup truck, the Endurance, on their behalf. Foxconn desperately needed such an exemplary showcase to demonstrate its cross-industry automotive capabilities to the world. However, in this bubble-ridden and PowerPoint-driven innovation circle, Chairman Terry Gou and Chairman Liu's tried and true precision algorithms from the 3C era were about to collide with a brutal logic blind spot. In the consumer electronics sector, Foxconn's manufacturing machine could run at full speed because it was driven by Apple's massive real demand. Yet when they forcibly applied this model to Lordstown, they shockingly discovered that their very foundation rested on an absurd and colossal lie. To inflate stock prices before a reverse merger IPO, Lordstown's founder threw out a suffocating bait. The company claimed to have received over 100,000 pre-orders from commercial fleets for its electric pickup truck that hadn't even reached mass production. But this was ultimately a lie. Under the investigation of well-known short seller Newgate Capital and the heavy-handed crackdown by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the bubble was brutally punctured. The so-called super order of 100,000 vehicles turned out to be an extremely shoddy fraud. One order worth over $700 million for 14,000 units came from a shell company registered in a small apartment in Texas. Another order of 1,000 units was placed by a startup with only 2 employees, whose contact address was merely a UPS drop point. To create this illusion of grandeur, the founders spent money on worthless, non-binding documents that required no deposit. When Foxconn's massive contract manufacturing machinery was set to launch operations in Ohio as agreed upon, harsh reality delivered a severe blow. There was no demand, no customers, and even the supply chain for assembly parts began to fracture. After painstakingly assembling just 6 pickup trucks by hand, this production line, once full of promise, fell into an eerie silence. In the face of such a partner who had built its foundation on fraud, now mired in SEC investigations, and was only capable of incessant bloodletting, Foxconn once again displayed the absolute coldness rooted deep within its DNA. As Losttown's stock price plummeted like an avalanche below Nasdaq's $1 delisting threshold, Foxconn seized upon breach clauses related to stock performance in their contract, turning its back with ruthless decisiveness. They firmly refused any further capital injections and yanked the last plug from this life support system. On the 27th of June 2023, with no other options left, Losttown officially filed for bankruptcy protection in court. As the last breath was taken, the new American forces launched a fierce counter-suit against Hon Hai with extreme animosity. They tore off their masks to accuse Hon Hai of harboring malicious intent from the start and lacking genuine commitment to save them. Their so-called deep collaboration was merely bait for trapping prey. The ultimate plot of Hon Hai was to use harsh wager conditions to deliberately drive them into a dead end, then mercilessly snatch away the core American factory at an extremely low price, along with plundering 400 valuable technical talents. When the tide of capital recedes, moral accusations in court appear pale and powerless, regardless of whether Hon Hai is accused of malicious breach of contract. From the cold commercial outcome, the empire has obtained everything it desired. This super factory located in Ohio now stands transformed into a stronghold for Hon Hai to secure subcontracting orders from other car manufacturers in North America's heartland. However, the $300 million spent was not just about acquiring a factory, but also provoking an ultimate reflection that left Hon Hai's upper echelons sweating coldly. The collapse of Losttown illuminated like a blinding lightning strike the abyss lurking beneath Hon Hai's grand automotive dream with Mai. This contract manufacturing behemoth finally realized, in the upcoming era of smart vehicle exploration, they were facing a dilemma where their massive industrial aircraft carrier was devoid of genuine passengers. They waved the banner of open source, aiming to become an Android plus TSMC of the automotive world. The fragmented script ends here. But currently, the majority of those attracted to upload are weak players like Losttown, lacking core competitiveness and genuine market appeal. If Foxconn cannot find a supergiant client in this vast ocean that can feed its millions of production lines with real demand, similar to Apple, then this highly precise contract manufacturing machine will eventually be consumed by massive overcapacity and sunk costs. Looking back at Foxconn's commercial journey spanning half a century, it is far from an ordinary account of factory expansions. Instead, it resembles a Darwinian evolutionary history, soaked in meticulous calculation, cold-blooded trial and error, and ruthless elimination. Mentioning earlier that Chairman Guo often carries a string of prayer beads he obtained from a temple dedicated to Genghis Khan, one could say this leader, who takes the 13th century Mongol conqueror as his spiritual idol, rules his industrial empire with Spartan-like military despotism. He frequently compares himself to an indestructible cockroach and a hard-working water buffalo. In this global supply chain jungle where the weak are eaten by the strong, he understands that only by stripping away all unnecessary warmth and squeezing every drop of resources to its limit can his enterprise survive until dawn. This extreme worship of efficiency stems from the cold financial gravity hanging over Foxconn's empire. In recent years, Foxconn has endured extremely low gross margins of about 6% and net profit rates of only around 2.5%, struggling to process substantial revenues on a production line with almost zero tolerance for error. At this management level, frugality is enforced to an unsettling degree. To squeeze out profits, the hand soap in factory restrooms has been continuously diluted. This machine converts massive scale into cash flow velocity through an extremely stringent accounting process, while ruthlessly transforming the physical bodies of its workers into cogs on the production line. However, what truly instills fear in people regarding Honhai is its beast-like intuition that allows it to adapt and transcend macro-geo-economic cycles. When coastal demographic dividends were depleted, it swiftly and coldly relocated to inland regions, such as Zhengzhou, greedily diluting new geographical benefits. When starved by Apple's insatiable demand for orders, it pounced like a ravenous wolf on the struggling old supplier network, even betraying its promise of maintaining Japanese management and avoiding layoffs to carve out an opening in the supply chain. As traditional internal combustion vehicles decline and the era of intelligence arrives, Honhai decisively launched the Mi-C platform, aiming to reassert dominance in lucrative avenues like electric vehicles and semiconductor wafers. Each monumental pivot is accompanied by immense pain and significant sunk costs, yet this behemoth consistently finds the optimal solution for asset restructuring at the brink of crisis. When we observe this colossal global manufacturing machine from a higher temporal perspective, an overwhelming sense of destiny becomes apparent. This Eastern colossus that has climbed up from the depths of the global supply chain's lowest rung, its entire vitality and fear stemming from perpetual hunger, possesses no followers of its own nor any brand soul that connects directly with consumers' hearts. Behind all its astonishing figures is this unending pursuit, horrific efficiency and ruthless exploitation. In the end, it remains nothing more than a tool rationality attached to super-tier clients. Foxconn's strength lies in its extreme exploitation of business tools, yet its tragedy is equally clear. When a tool evolves to become overwhelmingly indispensable, it still cannot escape being chosen, guarded against, or even discarded at any moment. In the new world ruled by urban algorithmic codes and unmanned factories, this scarred behemoth will continue its frenzied run across the barren plains of global supply chains, like an isolated wolf. It dares not pause nor look back, for in the brutal arena of the globalization capital game, slowing down means instant annihilation by the immense capacity and the abyss of time behind it.